Hello. In this lecture we will look at Carolingian and Ottonian art from the time period of the 6th through the 9th century Common Era. Carolingian refers specifically to art created or inspired by the Emperor Charlemagne. Charlemagne was a Frankish, that's F-R-A-N-C, or sometimes spelled F-R-A-N-K. The Franks were a people who lived in Central Europe, in what is today Germany and France, and he was a king, a Frankish king, who tried to reestablish the dominance of what had been the northeastern quadrant of the Roman Empire, centered in what is today Germany. And there was a historical capital of the Roman Empire, a provincial capital, in a city called Aachen in what is today the Bavarian region of Germany. Now, this is southern Germany. It's close to Italy and Austria and France. And so the Franks were a people who had been part of the empire in the time of Constantine. But as the empire started to collapse and crumble, what happened was that this region splintered off and became its own territory under a series of kings. And Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, that's what Charlemagne means, was one such Frankish king. And he tried to reestablish not only the rule in that region, but also in the rest of Europe and down into Italy. Now, this is not the first attempt to kind of restore authority and power of what had been the empire, but it is definitely one of the most successful and one of the most important restoration attempts. He was actually quite successful in a military and political sense, and while he was not fully embraced by the church, he was supported by other areas within the north, and he was able to somewhat establish, not quite a full empire, but certainly a large territory under his control. Now, this is only the first time that we'll hear the word Renaissance. Renaissance is a French term which means rebirth, and whenever we talk about Renaissance, what's being reborn or what's being renewed is classicism, specifically the two types of classicism from the Greeks and Romans. And so Charlemagne was at heart a classicist in the Roman sense. He wanted to bring about the restoration of the empire, and he understood, like Roman emperors understood, the importance of art and culture to both the political propaganda message of it, and its effect on his people, and how he could influence his rivals through that same message. So this is a look at what would have been Charlemagne's empire. And we see that it stretches from the Danube and Rhine regions of what is today Germany, as far west as the western borders of France and down into to the edge of the Pyrenees Mountains. So, in fact, France is a remnant of the Franks. These are the same people. And you can see that Paris and only the northwestern coast of France, known as Brittany, those were the only people who were never really in France, what is today the country of France, who were never part of Charlemagne's authority. Eventually, the Franks would push the Britons out of Europe, or out of mainland Europe, and only into the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of what is Great Britain. And the Britons are the people who came, and we'll talk about them later, and they came to England and conquered England. And we see their legacy. Now, by the time of the end of Charlemagne's reign, around the beginning of the 9th century, and then the subsequent rules of the Ottos, we see that Charlemagne's his influence is felt all over Europe, and he pushes down into Italy and conquers Rome. Now he makes a deal with the Pope to become the political leader. He has the support of the Pope, and actually the Pope crowns him the Holy Roman Emperor. And so that's an important connection. It's a political connection. But the Pope, of course, gives his blessing to Charlemagne. And we see that expressed in the art. Charlemagne becomes a Christian leader, a Catholic leader, and that's an important legacy that he leaves to the subsequent kings, the Ottos. They become protectors and rulers that are supporters of the church. Now, this is, in terms of architecture, the most famous example left by Charlemagne. And what you're seeing here is a palace, an old palace that had been built by the Romans centuries earlier in Aachen. And what Charlemagne does is refurbish that palace and add an important element. He adds a chapel. That's something that you would see in subsequent royal dwellings, is always a chapel or some sort of religious place to allow the king, allow the court to worship. But that's something that is new with Charlemagne. The Roman emperor had never, unlike other cultures, the Roman emperor had never endorsed a single religion, and so in Roman palaces there were no temples attached to the palace. There were temples in the city, and the emperors would make offerings from time to time, but never like what you see later with with Charlemagne and those to come after. He builds his chapel on a slightly different style than we would see further to the south. It's more Byzantine in style. And the Byzantine style is a centralized plan. And so instead of building it like a basilica, like you might see further to the south, it's built in a plan that has a central altar, and it has four equal arms like the Byzantine style would have. And so it's very central. Now that actually has its connection to the Roman Pantheon, which was built around in that cylindrical form. Like the Roman predecessors, he favored elaborate and wealthy materials, expensive tile work. The marbles used to decorate the interior here are some of the finest in the world. Tiger marble, because of its patterning, black and dark marbles, which are very rare and very expensive even today. This is his throne that he built into the Palatine Chapel at Aachen. And it's important because it's elevated in the same way at the same height as the altar. So in the Roman system, the emperor, no one was above the emperor, and no god. The emperor didn't answer to any god. But, Charlemagne was careful to balance his approach because he understood that by the time of his reign in the 8th century, the church was a very strong and powerful force, and people's faith was also renewed, faith in politics, because as the empire collapsed, there was a sense of chaos in Europe. There was no centralized government, and because of that, it was sort of a free-for-all in terms of the way that people lived. And a strong ruler might emerge, and then after they died or they left they left a vacancy. And so Charlemagne fills that vacancy, and he brings a centralized government to Europe for the first time in centuries. But he was really careful not to elevate himself above the church, and that's an important element. He wants to show himself as above the people, but not above the church. He is a believer. Now, this is an equestrian portrait of Charlemagne. It's cast in bronze, again, a medium and a practice that had been popular with the Romans, but had not been in widespread use in centuries. And then the equestrian portrait itself, this goes back to the traditions of the great Roman emperors, Marcus Aurelius and others. He's showing himself holding the sphere of leadership in his hand. His right hand, there most likely would have been at one time either a golden staff or scepter of some sort that's been taken or long since gone. And he's wearing a crown that combines the laurel wreath crown that was typical for kings to wear with the images of the cross. So that connection, the fact that it connects the political and spiritual leadership together into one person, is an important part of Charlemagne's rule and his influence. Now, in terms of realism, some of the realism that would have been typical with a Greek or Roman example is lost because, the practice of carving large-scale works or casting large-scale works had fallen out of favor and fashion, and in fact, it was outlawed in the early church because it was seen as a pagan tradition. So, sculptures, large-scale sculptures of figures were all seen as something that the Romans had done and the pagans had done, and not acceptable subject matter or acceptable practices for in the new church, in the new era of the new church. And so, anytime you don't use a skill or use a concept, you'll lose it, or it'll be diminished. And so we see evidence of that here. The formal realism is not as powerful as it would have been in a late empire example. But it's still impressive, and it's still an important restoration of the practice and of the idea. Now, these manuscript pages come from a typical, or actually not atypical, it's not typical, I should say, manuscript of the period. This is from the Coronation Gospels of Charlemagne, and it's important because these were made for Charlemagne and not for, so this is the highest example possible. And so what's really important about these pages is they show the finest example available at the time. And they combine stylistically the traditions of the East and the West. So what we see here is a stylistic combination that something like you might see in a Celtic or Northwestern European, Britain, Saxon, that style, manuscript illumination, and what you might see in the Eastern Byzantine style, and then farther to the south. So it's a combination of text and of figurative elements. You also notice that the text becomes a part of the manuscript. Instead of the illuminations being separate from the text but adorning the text, the letters themselves become a part of the illumination. And so what we see for the first time, or well, really it's a connection to something that had been started just previously in the medieval period. But this is really the beginnings of kind of a graphic design approach to these types of imagery. And I think stylistically, there's an element of an attempt at realism. The figure is supposed to be seated on a throne. It's an attempt at perspective. It's not completely successful, but I think it is important that this is the beginnings of that process to try and create a realistic imagery in two dimensions that we'll see fulfilled through the Gothic and into the High Renaissance in Italy. Now, these illuminators over time became famous and known as master illuminators, and they actually went on to be mimicked and to followed, and in a sense, in that classical model of learning from the previous generations. And so this model of looking at what the previous generations had done and then mimicking it or following it is an important element. That's a classical model, and it's not necessarily something that had been in practice in the previous generations of the early medieval. Another element, stylistic element that returns is the use of light and dark in modeling, and Roman elements, very, very specific Roman elements. The furniture is Roman, the dress is Roman, but the subject matter is not. The subject matter is Mark, the gospel writer, and so it's a combination of the pagan and the Christian coming together for the first time. Now, in lesser manuscripts, what we tend to see are more hastier drawn elements, slightly less successful in terms of realism, just an outline, no color. But the idea is that these types of manuscripts could be more quickly reproduced and allow more of the public to have access, because that was really important, that idea of access to Scripture in the Carolingian Empire, because it was an idea spread through that the church was an important part of the success of Charlemagne, that he had the blessing of the church, and that was important. So he wanted to spread, and he became a champion of faith, not necessarily of the church as a body. The Ottos that would come later would continue and really champion the church. Charlemagne kind of fell out with the Pope when the Pope started to believe that he wanted to control the church. But he did play an important role in spreading Christianity as a message, and we see that in these manuscripts. We also see a more narrative attempt in the manuscripts. Rather than them just be about illuminating the text, they really do become more illustrative. So we see stories, specific sequential stories, told in a single register. Here, the story of Moses coming down from the mountain and the parting of the Red Sea and the building of the tabernacle and the temple, and all of that happening in a very short, few images, but you get the meaning behind what the text is telling you. Now, under the Ottos, the Carolingian Empire spread and then eventually broke apart, and it broke apart into a few pieces that are part of today part of France, part of Eastern Europe and Croatia, part of Austria, Germany, Hungary. And what we see is an attempt by there were three Ottos, so each, subsequent kings. They were known as the kings of Bavaria, and they tried to expand the territory, but also to cement the legacy of Charlemagne and to kind of reconcile with the church. This is a period of great upheaval, and it's the beginning of the transition from the medieval through the Romanesque and into the Gothic. In fact, the Ottos are that transition from late medieval into Romanesque. And stylistically, they're carrying forward some of Charlemagne's influence, his bringing back of classicism, but they're tempering it with a little bit more Roman influence, a little bit more Latin or church influence. So the building of these churches, and that was one of the things that the Ottos were very big on, was a campaign to build bigger, more impressive churches to expand the influence of the church as a body. And they're built on Latin plans, like whereas Charlemagne used the Byzantine centralized plan, the Ottos used a plan that was more Latin. It's based on the basilica. And so this is actually the beginning of what will become the plans for the Gothic cathedrals that we'll see in subsequent generations. Now, these churches were built also fortress-like. They are, there's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of different factions within the church. There's a lot of different, a lot of division in Europe, a lot of battles being fought and campaigns being fought to try and take over a different territory. And so the churches themselves had to become places of sanctuary. They had to become places where the people could be protected. So what they ended up becoming were these large, austere, very bulky, very heavy places. They're built with stone. There's not a lot of windows. And so on the interior, they tended to become kind of dark. And so we'll see, when we look at the insides, they're not the big, open, welcoming, kind of bright, colorful spaces that we'll see later with the Gothic. But the beginning is there. They go back to the flat coffered ceilings that would have been typical in Roman period, especially the late Empire period. But they incorporate new elements like the large arches, the vaults, that we'll see common in later Gothic, well, some Romanesque, but then certainly by the Gothic period. A continuation of that basilica plan with the use of columns and arches, Corinthian columns, and rows of arches to get greater height and to give it a grandeur. We also see the incorporation of towers, and the towers are placed at various points. What's interesting about these churches is that this is really before the kind of typical, what we think of as how you would build a building, where they would start with a set of plans, and that they would build the building until it was finished. They would work on it till it was finished. These churches were built in relatively smaller communities, and they would work on the plan. They would work on building until they ran out of funds or ran low on funds, or till they, perhaps the builder might die, the architect might die, and that somebody else would have to pick up and continue. And you can actually see that in the structure itself. If you look at the column on the left, as it gets to a certain height, it's made from one type of stone and has one type of plan, and then the top is completely different. And that's a reflection of, they built to a certain point, and then they stopped for a time, and then the builder took over, and a different builder took over and built in a slightly different plan, slightly different style. And that was not uncommon in the day. So what we end up with are structures that have this sort of odd stylistic mixture even within the building itself, and they don't have a unified style. What made these structures so interesting was not so much their overall plan, but the unique differences that one might have over another. So they all might have kind of something similar in terms of the interior of how it was used and what it was used for, but certain things like rotundas or certain apses and certain chapels and certain towers and certain, that's what made them unique and special. And the churches themselves became destinations for travelers. Travelers knew that they could, if they made it to a church and they were a Christian, that they would be provided with some safety as they traveled, and that was difficult to come by. And so the church would provide them some sanctuary, some safety, and then in exchange for an offering, they might be able to spend the night along their travels. And that's partly how the churches became able to support themselves, was by offering travelers this safety and a place to stay. And so then the churches became known for that, and they would visitors would come to a certain church, not just to be safe, but also to see the church, to see the beauty of it, to see its mosaics, to see its sculpture. And the churches became adorned with these sculptures that look back and forward at the same time. So here, this is called the Hildesheim column, and it's a famous example of carving from the period. It's interesting because it looks back to the tradition of memorial columns, monumental columns, like we saw in the Roman Empire with Trajan, and it tells us continuous narrative in the same way that Trajan's column does, and other columns like it. From bottom to top, it tells the story of the passion and death of Jesus and resurrection, but it's obviously a Christian motif, Christian subject matter. But objects like this became famous all over Europe, and they would attract visitors to see the sculpture, to see the art and culture at different churches. Now, humanistic or figurative forms in sculpture during the Ottonian period took on a more religious nature. Specifically, we see images like this one. This is the Giro crucifix. The image of Christ crucified is not something that would have been common in the early church as a subject matter, as a theme. But during the Carolingian and Ottonian period, Christ's humanity, his sacrifice, his life and death were a major theme and an important one because of the nature of society at the time. That they wanted to play up the role of sacrifice, the role of providing your service, and that's what Christ did, and they wanted people to see that and to emulate that in Christ, and then of course to see that Christ's sacrifice is what made them Christian. Now, Ottonian manuscripts take on a bit more Byzantine flair. There's some really interesting and unique details that you'll see. The incorporation of Latin, which was not the official language of the Charlemagne Empire, but during the Ottonians, the spread of the use of Latin, specifically within the church, to kind of reinforce the roots and traditions within the church. Also, elements of combining the religious with the contemporary political. So you'll see religious figures, and in some scenes, and in other scenes, you'll see important figures from the day, from the period. Now, this is an attempt at, believe it or not, at perspective. What you're supposed to be seeing here is this space. This is an interior within that larger church structure that's suggested by the top. But the artist didn't know how to do that, how to realistically draw an interior so that you understood where it came from. And that wouldn't come along again until the Gothic period, really, when we'll see the renewal of an interest in realistic perspective. So the Carolingian and Ottonian period is important because it brings about the link between the the medieval and what ultimately will become the Romanesque and the Gothic. And it's the first attempt really at a Renaissance, but we'll see that legacy, that restorative legacy of classicism come back again and again in subsequent generations. All right, so look for the next lecture coming soon.